Good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining us today. My colleague Jimmy and I are hosting this webinar this morning on social value. It is designed for procurement commissioners, contract managers who are market facing. But if you are an attendee in the marketplace, if you're a supplier to the public sector, it could be really useful as well. So hopefully it is open to all audiences. Just before we get started, I'll just run through some basic housekeeping. We'll do proper introductions in a second. As always, we are on Zoom, so the session is being recorded today. A copy of the recording and a copy of the slides that Jimmy and I are using today will be sent out to all attendees. We usually aim to get them out within 24, 48 hours. So really by close of business tomorrow, you should have both of those things. And we do try to, I know we're on a Zoom webinar, but we do try to make them as interactive as we can. So if you've got any questions, the Q&A is open and the chat is open. We'll both keep an eye on them as we go. So if you've got any questions or anything that you want to add into the chat, please feel free. If you want to introduce yourself on the chat, you absolutely can as well. So we're covering an overview of social value. So Jimmy will take the top end of the session this morning, talking about social value, what it is, and how it relates then into procurement, which is where I'll pick up. And then we'll think about how we can embed social value through procurement in our organisations, thinking about the marketplace specifically and thinking more focused on micro, small, medium enterprises, voluntary community and social enterprises, so MSMEs and VCSEs, how we can use social value to help us open up the marketplace so that we can be as accessible as possible in our procurements. We have got some time carved out for questions at the end, but please don't feel like you need to wait for that. As I've said, use the chat and the Q&A functionality throughout. We will keep an eye on it. And if there's any questions that we need to take as we go, we can. So just a little bit of background on me before I hand over to Jimmy. So I'm, along with Jimmy, one of three co-founders of Go for Growth. We're a social enterprise. I am a procurement professional by trade. So this is my 31st year in procurement in both private and public sectors. And I'm also a long-standing micro business, small business owner. And I think what that means is we've walked a mile in both pairs of shoes. So we understand the pressures and the governance and the compliance, the regulatory context for procurement, but we also understand how that permeates through to the marketplace as well. So hopefully we bring experience from both sides of the lens, if that makes sense. Jimmy, over to you.
Thanks, Jill. Hi, everyone. Jimmy Brannigan with Net Positive Futures. My background is sustainability, social value, CSR, all of those fine words that I will talk to you about in a moment. And just to add one more thing to what Jill said there in terms of walking in different pairs of shoes. In the past week or so, I've been working on helping a business develop a tender for a construction project where the carbon and sustainability elements are up at 20% of the tender. And I've just come off a call from a council who are trying to embed this into their procurement processes to deliver their carbon net zero agenda. So we see it from both sides and we try to bring that with what we're doing. So I'm going to move ahead on here. So as I said, my background is of sustainability, social value, all those fine words, and I've always done it. I used to work for the Environment Agency whilst I was at university, and then ended up working in the environmental sector for many years. And a lot of time I was also traveling a lot. So that was working with corporate organizations around the world. And one of the things you discover the more you're engaged in the sustainability agenda or social value agenda is the proliferation of language. And what we do whenever we're starting these sorts of sessions or engaging with businesses on social value, we really need to get to understand the language and what it means, because ESG, we talk about that, and if you're a larger business or you work in this world, certain parts of this world, you'll understand environmental social governance. We've got social value, sustainability. You might hear circular economy, which is followed on from cradle to cradle thinking, which was Michael Braungart. I think the point I'm making here is that if we're trying to embed social value, and we'll say social value, into the procurement process, then we have to understand what's at the very heart of this. And what's at the very heart of it are the same three things. That's how do we consider the environmental, social, and economic impacts of the project? If we're writing a sustainability strategy, we need to be looking at the environmental, the social, the economic. So I'll say that again. This proliferation of language is set to confuse. And what we need to do is get beneath that and say, right, it's always the same. It's the environmental, the social, and the economic, and we pay attention to those things as part of what we do. Jill, if you just move the slides, that'd be great. And just to give you a slightly different lens, excuse the pun, in terms of this agenda, what we've got here is the different terminology. And what we've tried to do is say where it tends to lead us. So the social value agenda, which has been one of the newer agendas, if you like, since the Social Value Act, has tended to focus organisations on the socio-economic impact. So when we start to look at social value, we talk about apprenticeships, we talk about jobs, we talk about money in the local economy, and environment doesn't really come in as much. But then when we talk about environmental sustainability, people often push this towards just the environmental agenda. It's about carbon, it's about the natural environment, it's around natural capital, etc. But the truth is, whatever language set we're using, it's the balance of all three. And I'm labouring the point because it's really important. Because when you're developing social value criteria, we should not forget that the environmental element is as important as the others, because actually we don't have value without a planet. And this is my only environmental bit, and I won't dwell on it. We don't have value, social value, without natural capital. We don't have value without the environmental resources and ecosystems supporting us. That's why it's important to get the balance of three. Uh, so in terms of whatever the language, social value or sustainability, I use them interchangeably. So when we're reading it, think about those three elements. Thanks, Jill. One of the other things that you may have come across, and I think and you will have come across, is the Sustainable Development Goals. Now, the Sustainable Development Goals are a little bit like a sustainability plan for the planet, put together by the UN, agreed globally. I think some countries in North America and the US might be pulling away from some of these, but agreed globally. And what it said was actually to move forward on a planetary level, then we need to pay attention to some of the pinch points, some of the challenges. And those, I won't read them all out, but as you can see, this talks about poverty and well-being. Many of the themes we see coming through on the sustainability and social value agenda. We talk about sustainable consumption or responsible consumption and production, looking at life on the land and the impact on the water, and obviously climate action. And what we often see is when we're thinking about embedding social value within procurement or developing our social value commitments as an organization, often people just reflect the SDGs and say, well, which of these SDGs are important to us? And I've seen strategies and been part of strategies and plan developments where we said, well, actually, out of all of those 17, these are the ones that we want to focus on. But in truth, many of the projects you will deliver, whether you're on the buying side or you're actually contracting side, will touch on many of these issues. And it's just being aware of them and understanding where the impact and opportunity lies. And if you just move on to the next slide, Jill, I just want to illustrate another point. The SDGs are often shown as that mass that I've just shown you across the 17, but actually, if we reframe it, we can see that the SDGs look at economy, so the finance, but they look at society, the social, and they look at the biosphere, which is the sort of platform, if you like, in terms of what this is built on. So the environmental, social, and economic. So it comes through on the SDGs. We just don't see it like that. And the reason I particularly like this diagram is because it highlights the fact that society and economy are built on that foundation of natural capital. Can't get away from it. Water, land, air, they provide the natural resources that we thrive as a society and economically, and it's done in partnership, hence partnership in the middle. So yeah, so it's still the environmental, social, economic. If I just go on one more slide, Jill, that'd be great. And one of the other challenges, and these are all challenges, but they are surmountable, I hasten to add, when we're procuring or we're tendering, is the sheer volume of potential issues that face us, if you like, under the sustainability agenda. This diagram was originally put together when I was working with the police force, looking at some of the priorities that they might want to think about in terms of their social value sustainability commitments. And as you can see, we've categorized it as social, environmental, and economic. But what we've also tried to highlight here is the interrelationship between issues. You don't just do one thing. So when we're thinking about social value, we can employ someone in a certain way that minimize the impact on the environment. We can bring them back into employment. We can support disadvantaged groups who will then actually invest in the economy. So the interrelationships or the system, if you like, of impacts is really interrelated. And we just wanted to flag this. Now, also what we can see here is that we've got where these link to the themes, outcomes and measures, or the TOMs. So when we're looking at the sustainability issues, there's many of them. So we need to understand which are relevant for us when we're doing a procurement, but also there are some well-developed measures, proxies and potential quantifications if you're going down that route. Once again, we won't cover that in any detail today, but just to be aware that we can measure some of these things to quite a detailed level. But key points again, there are many issues to take into account. What we have to do is prioritize which ones are going to be relevant to us and recognize that we can often do more than one thing. So that's how it maximizes our potential impact. If we just move on, Jill, that'd be great. When I talk about maximizing potential impact, I said I work for Net Positive Futures, which we set up. And I want to show you just another way of thinking about sustainability and social value. And I particularly like this. And I found it particularly useful over the years, if I'm honest. And that is that when we're thinking about social value, what we're trying to do, and what we're really trying to do is increase it. We're not just about counting it. We want to increase it. So a good commitment to social value, to sustainability, whether this is a good plan, whether it's a way you've embedded it into a category strategy, identifies the social and economic impacts of value we're trying to create, and actually looks to increase that. So how do we ramp it up? If we're doing it, can we do more? If we're doing something that's having a negative impact, can we stop it? So that this is about increasing value over time, both socially and economically. Now, the environmental impact there at the bottom might seem a bit strange because you might be saying, why haven't I tried to increase that? Because you can. You can increase environmental impact in terms of by an enhancement of natural capital. So that might be increasing biodiversity. However, most organisations have a negative environmental impact by their very nature. And this is not a criticism of you or I or Jill or any other organisation. We use resources, we travel, we waste occasionally, of course. So we have an environmental impact we have to recognise. And the key here is how do we minimise that environmental impact? If we can enhance through biodiversity enhancements, fantastic. But whilst we're minimising that environmental impact and try to turn it around if we can, how do we maximise that social and economic? And if you've got a plan, a strategy, or a commodity strategy, or a category strategy, and you're thinking, how do we move this forward? Then thinking in those terms of maximising that social and economic value, at the very least, minimising the environmental impact of the product, purchase, or category. And if we can, are there opportunities to increase that environmental contribution? Thanks, Jill. I found that very useful over the years to think about when analysing an organisation or a product or a service, what's the value it's inherently adding and how do I maximise it? And that's how I tend to think about those things. From a climate emergency point of view, which actually, I end up talking about this a lot in terms of carbon and climate now. If whether you were a business or a procurer, you were aware of, engaged with, recognise a climate emergency. What has happened is that the sort of political community in terms of government, local authorities have engaged with this agenda. And I was talking to a local authority before this meeting, the net zero team from that council. So local authorities are engaging with it, universities have strategy, the NHS as a whole has recognised the climate emergency, not only and that's climate and sort of biodiversity emergency as well in terms of natural capital. So we've got a public sector, including the APCC, Blue Light, and the police, the public sector, who are actually saying this is on the agenda. Jill will cover some of the drivers in the Act and the procurement legislation a little bit later. But just to say that from a personal perspective, and Jill will echo this, I'm sure, later, we've seen a change in terms of the amount of integration of sustainability and climate questions within the tendering process. I said earlier I was looking at something over the last week that makes up 20% of that tender on a construction project. And of that construction project, about 15% of it was specifically carbon and climate related. So it was carbon and climate related. There was less on that construction project around apprenticeships than I've ever seen. It was moving away from just the socio-economic and focusing on the carbon. So it's there. How we respond is important and how we manage that process. Jill? So I'm coming towards summarising. When I talk about sustainability, I'm talking about how do we maximise the positive contribution we have whilst minimising the negative. And that simple balance, if you like, and recognition, mature recognition that we have an environmental impact. We don't pretend, we don't greenwash. We have an environmental impact. How do we reduce it? But we also have inherent social value because we are organisations 99% of the time actually are trying to deliver value in what we do. Otherwise, if we're not trying to deliver value, why do we exist as an organization? So it's the purpose of organizations is to deliver value. It's just how that value is realized. So how do we maximize that value whilst reducing that impact? Forms the basis of a strategy, basis of a category strategy, basis of the types of questions we want to ask in a tender because we want to maximize value, reduce negative risk and impact. So when I talk about net positive sustainability and that net positive impact, it's about that balance. Jill? So, regardless of whether you're a procurement professional or a business or just someone who's come on to find out a little bit more about this, we often talk about where we focus. Now, in this sort of session I've done so far, I started off at the beginning talking about a proliferation of language. I showed you a slide that you probably couldn't read because there was 500 issues on there, all interrelated with arrows, and that makes me concerned, right? Let's call that the sphere of concern. And it's just a recognition that there are multiple issues we're going to have to deal with as a procurer or as a business wanting to work with the public sector or private sector. We recognize that. But we have to recognize also that within what we do and how we do it, we do have influence and we can influence in that agenda. We can address some of the concerns, not all of them, but some of them. But how we do that is go right back to the core of what we can control, whether it's as an individual or as a business or as a procurement team, within whatever context we're working. So what can we control? How do we maximize the value and the impact of that? The more we are consistent as an organization, as a team, as an individual in terms of what value we want to bring, the more our influence grows. For me, influence grows with consistency. So if we say something's important, it's important. If we say as a local authority, a university, a police force, that the climate is important, then actually it will be reflected in what we do. It'll be reflected in the tender. It'll be reflected in the questioning. It'll be reflected in the weighting. Because those signals of actually this is important have to come across in how we behave. So we always start with what we can control. We recognize the fear of concern, but we don't dwell there because dwelling there gets us lost. And by focusing on control, we exert more and more positive influence on sustainability and social value. I think that takes me to the end of my ramble, Jill. So I will hand back to you.
I mean, as always, Jimmy, it's a very insightful and intelligent ramble. So thank you for that. There's, I mean, that sphere of control, I think, is one of the key messages. In procurement, we are often the gatekeeper of many agenda. And actually, I mean, I've been in procurement for long enough, I think, to be able to say sometimes it can feel like we don't know where that should live, we'll put it in procurement. But where social value, climate, best value, quality, on time in full, all of those things, they sit very neatly in the junction of where procurement lives. But it can often feel overwhelming. And one of the jobs that we have in procurement is to try and manage the cohesion of all of those sometimes competing agenda to make sense of it in that procurement competition that goes out to market. And if we focus on social value specifically, being that that's the catch-all terminology in the public sector, in the UK public sector, so it does cover that natural capital, environmental and climate, and I'll talk more about that in a second. It's actually not new news for us in UK public sector. So the Public Services Act 2012 was assented to law in January 2013. So that piece of legislation is now over 13 years old. And what I guess it's trying to achieve is it's trying to help us direct spend towards those wider social, economic, and environmental goals. So by considering every pound that we're spending and the social impact, the social value impact that can be created to benefit communities, et cetera, is what the legislation is trying to do. So it's aiming at value for money for public spending. So rather than just focusing on the narrow core costs of a contract, factoring in social value allows us actually to think about who is the end user of this contract and what does value for money actually look like? And how can we utilize this spend that's generated by the taxpayer to do as much good as it possibly can? And it helps us fulfill policy obligations. And I'm going to talk about the National Procurement Policy Statement in a second, but it helps us fulfill local, regional, and national policy priorities and obligations. So things like inequality, community development, climate change, etc. Considering social value is the conduit that procurement uses to directly meet those policy goals that have been set by national and local government in those areas. And there is a legal requirement to consider social value. So there is a duty placed on us in procurement to consider the impact that that procurement can have and to understand it and to do so proportionately. And in fact, it can be super helpful, I think, in terms of being a leveller in the marketplace. So smaller organisations, voluntary sector organisations, outside of the core goods and services that they're providing, there is lots of social value being added. But one of the things that Jimmy and I see all the time, that slide that Jimmy showed around the proliferation of language, we are hosting social value workshops for providers all the time. And one of the common messages is, oh, I'm delivering lots of this. I just didn't know that it was social value. I didn't know to call it that stuff. I didn't have the language framework by which to recognize all these great things that I'm doing. And of course, if you don't understand the language, then bidding in that terminology becomes that much harder for smaller organizations. And so actually thinking about social value and thinking about the marketplace, it can actually really help improve supplier relationships. It can help the reputations of those commissioning organisations, and because it shows a commitment to using procurement budgets in a really responsible, ethical and sustainable way. And, 13 years ago, when the Social Value Act, the Public Services Act, became legislation, weightings on social value, I mean, we were seeing them down at 5%, if they were even included at all. Now we're seeing weightings in excess of 20%. So now social value, and we're coaching providers around this, social value can be bid winning, and therefore it can also be bid losing. What we're also seeing, and just to take Jimmy's point on climate, so we have carbon net zero 2050. The UK government has set a target to be net zero by 2050. we are often seeing in procurement that social value will have a weighting, 10, 20%, whatever it is, and actually carbon or climate emergency might be dealt with separately in the procurement. So actually, when you bring all of that together on aggregate, you can be looking at maybe 30% of all of the score being around climate, carbon, environment, and social value all together. And so it's really starting to grow a pair of teeth in terms of how bidders need to respond to it in order to be able to secure and maintain contracts in the public sector. And the Procurement Act really serves, in my opinion, to drive home that point even further. So there's an emphasis on social value, flexibility, transparency, and really it's aiming to modernise the procurement process. So the Act aims for contracting authorities to act with integrity, to treat suppliers equitably, but also promoting fair, green and innovative procurement processes. The intention, I guess, is to create a procurement system that's not just transparent, but also adaptable and allows for a competitive and flexible approach in selecting suppliers based on this thing called most advantageous tender, rather than most economically advantageous tender. So no longer just relying on the financials, the cost. It's not a fastest race to the bottom anymore. And it never needed to be fair, but there is real drivers now to think about the most broadest value that the procurement can deliver. And the transparency regime means that through the Procurement Act, which has been with us since February 24th, 2024, there is transparency right throughout the procurement life cycle, including supplier performance metrics being published, but also that preliminary market engagement. So the Act is really driving contracting authorities to get to know the markets and to talk to them as early as possible. And that will come up a little bit later as well. So the National Procurement Policy Statement was launched February 25, the Act went live, not 24. What does the National Procurement Policy Statement do? When I describe it, it's the policy that enshrines the regulations. So it's what's important to us. How do we seek to go out to market? So achieving value for money is always the overarching priority in public procurement. So that must include consideration of outcomes, quality to avoid waste. We don't want poor quality bids of low value. We want to optimise the use of public funds, balancing effectiveness, efficiency and economy over the whole life cycle of goods and services or works. And it's all about achieving the intended outcomes of the procurement. And those outcomes are socio-economic and environmental, as well as financial benefits. So you can see, if you're familiar with mission-driven government, these will be familiar with you, but the 5 aims of the National Procurement Policy Statement. So kickstarting economic growth, for example. So one of the things the NPPS says is that contracting authorities can deliver value for money by driving economic growth and strengthening supply chains by giving small and medium-sized enterprises and voluntary community and social enterprises a fair chance, creating high-quality jobs and championing innovation, and delivering social and economic value that supports government missions, including working in partnership across organisational boundaries where appropriate. Thinking about being a clean energy superpower and how that manifests itself in procurement and breaking down those barriers to opportunity. And of course, we have procurement policy notes that come out. And the very first procurement policy note that came out, PPN 001, was about mandating all central government departments and their executive agencies to set a 3-year target for direct spend with SMEs and a 2-year target for direct spend with VCSEs to be achieved in the financial year ending 2028, publishing results annually. So there's a real drive as part of that social value and that quest to deliver social and environmental value to make sure that we are open to business to smaller organisations. And those targets are currently voluntary for the wider public sector. And it will be interesting to see how that's adopted by local government, by NHS trusts, by police forces, etc., where that mandate doesn't exist, as we see the drive as part of social value delivery to widen participation and to be more accessible and to, to influence diversity in our supply chains. Not a new agenda. It came out last February, and we are hoping that lots of contracting authorities will get on board with that because it's a huge part of the delivery of social value. And actually thinking about that, what have we learned in Go for Growth about what the barriers are for smaller organisations? How can we remove those barriers? So part of our, I guess our practice as procurement professionals is to consider those barriers and then to actually work through how we can tangibly remove those barriers to entry and growth. I won't talk through them all. They will come out on the slide deck, but I'll pick out a few. Preliminary market engagement notices. So that pre-market engagement, talking to the market as early as possible. It's about more than just the notices for me. It's about the process of that conversation. It's about getting to know the market, to understand the capacity, the capability, and the innovation that's in that market. But it is useful that above threshold, for example, those PME notices are there. And we did see something like, I think between February and May last year, there's something like 820 preliminary market engagement notices that were published. So it seems to have really sparked a different type of engagement with the marketplace. We had always done meet the buyer stuff. COVID, the global pandemic hit us, and actually a lot of that stopped. Now we see a real resurgence, but the marketplace tells us, talk to us as much as you can and as early as you can. Even if things change later in the process, be as transparent as you can be about what you're trying to achieve and the tools that you'll use to go out to market. So we have competitive flexible procedure, which means actually we can be outcomes based, two-stage process minimum. Actually, what it means for the marketplace is lots of those competitive flexible procedures will be different to each other. So the more that we can be transparent about not just what we're going to buy, but the mechanism about how we're going to buy it and how we will embed social value in that process is really useful. And if thinking about transparency and what the social agenda is, as well as the core goods and services agenda, again, the Act has mandated that pipeline notices should be published, but that's only in excess of 2 million total contract value, and only where there is more than 100 million expenditure, I believe, in the contracting authority. Smaller organisations and voluntary sector organisations, which is the lifeblood of social value delivery, are often below threshold and in much lower value opportunities, but they still need the same time to prepare for those opportunities as we might do for a big or complex procurement. So thinking actually about how do you let the market know what you have got coming and what the social value agenda might look like for that is really useful. But also, we did a survey with YPO a couple of years ago now, where we asked, it was 150 buyers that answered the survey, and we asked about the baselining of spend. So it's not just about how many SMEs are on your frameworks, but it's actually how many are taking commercial business through your contracting authority. And we got a really mixed bag. So there was around 25% of contracting authorities that didn't know what their baseline spend was to small to medium enterprises or the voluntary sector. And then about 30% who were measuring it but didn't have any sort of target. So they didn't have any aspiration necessarily around where that spend would go. Given that we think that there is a real core of social value delivery in smaller organisations, knowing what your baseline is, so knowing what today looks like, and then really understanding what that progression ambition looks like is really useful. And of course, it's not all about direct spend. So it's not always about SMEs and VCSEs spending their money directly with a contracting authority, even though that is what the Procurement Policy Note 001 is tracking. The supply chain is often where we'll find lots of smaller organisations. And so making sure that we're connecting the dots around how those big corporates, those principal contractors, tier one organisations, actually flow down to local, smaller organisations and really pull the social value through into the procurement and back out into the local community is really important. And they, of course, have a lot of flexibility around that because generally speaking, there'll be private sector organisations. So there is in that family tree, the responsibility sits with the contracting authority at the top and how you can make sure that the social value commitment and the accessibility for local organisations and smaller organisations flows right the way throughout the supply chain, not just in that direct relationship one-on-one. Jimmy, have we got any questions that we need to answer before I move on? Do you know? I'm just
Uh,
seeing. Go on, sorry.
yeah, no question specifically. Richard Dickens mentioned that he's seen waiting of up to 40% with local authorities, but there's no other specific question, which is high. That was, but for a tech tender, so it's sort of embedded carbon, just
Yeah.
we directives, disposal, all sorts of stuff. Packaging probably came into it,
But do
but
you know, and I'm still as a procurement practitioner. I mean, we see procurements that are not testing cost. They are the minority, I think, but we are seeing those weightings change. So we're seeing cost actually being not deprioritized, but reprioritized so that it's proportionate in terms of what we want. And we're seeing of that quality spectrum, the social value elements really growing in stature. And the message is actually we have got to prepare the marketplace for this. They are who the marketplace delivers this. They create the impact in our local communities. And if we think that there is a proliferation of language, we think that there is a lot of agenda going on for procurement, we're passing that through to the supply chain. We've got to help remove those barriers for smaller organisations so that they can take part and make the contribution that we know that they can make. So if I think about I've broken the procurement life cycle down into three: pre-procurement, sourcing, and then contract management. How can we embed it? I won't talk through all of this either, but some things to note. What we're trying to do is in that slide that Jimmy showed in terms of net positive sustainability, it's not just about reducing the negatives, although it is about reducing the negatives. It doesn't stop there. We are thinking about increasing the positives, and every project is different in procurement. So there'll be different risks and there'll be different opportunities, and the proportionality will be different. And so the job that we do in pre-procurement is to clarify what's important to us and what's in that sphere of control that Jimmy talked about. So what can we influence? What can we tangibly do different through this procurement to add more social and environmental impact? How do we plan that? What does that look like over the life cycle of this procurement? And that might be, if it's a dynamic purchasing system, that could well be 10 years, or a dynamic market as we've got now, that could be a long period of time. So we're really having to think about what's the journey that we're going on socially. And how do we balance that value versus cost, and how do we select the right route to market? If we understand who the market is in that pre-procurement phase, what will give us the best possible exposure to sustainability opportunities through the whole life cycle? We can't answer that without knowing the market, without knowing the capability and the capacity and who is in the market. And we might have to develop and coach and guide and lead that market. We might need to upskill that market. But without understanding that, then actually we are always not guessing, but we don't know if we can land the impact that we're trying to land. And of course, at this point in that pre-procurement stage, we really want to understand how we'll score sustainability and social value. It's part of the core requirement. I've answered procurements over the last 15 years where frustratingly social value has been additional but non-scored. And what that says from the contracting authority is, we want you to do something for nothing. So we think social value is important enough to put it in there, but we're not going to pay you for it. We're not going to score you on it. And that's a real mixed message to the marketplace. So if social value is important, then weight it accordingly. Make sure that that message is proportionate and balanced and that you're scoring it really well. And Jimmy and I run workshops on social value and how to score it. Having 30 questions on social value will be really challenging for a marketplace, no matter how capable and talented they are. So think about actually proportionality of the evaluation as well as the actual social value in and of itself. And in sourcing stage, we're thinking about selection and evaluation. So how important is that criteria? Set those expectations early, and your social value and sustainability credentials will run all the way through the process and have appropriate due diligence associated to it. And that should be evidence-based due diligence. We're looking for sustainability commitments. We're looking to avoid things like greenwashing that Jimmy mentioned. And so we're thinking actually about how will this get implemented. So we want to be able to take the sustainability commitments that are made in the sourcing stage and flow them through into contract management. Because what we're not looking for is some nice words on a bit of paper in a bid. What we're really looking for, as Jimmy said, is change. We're looking for actual, measurable, tangible impact. We're looking to create sustainability and social value opportunities. And so what we need to make sure in that sourcing stage is that the contract that we're tendering for can be managed and the social value can be implemented and therefore measured afterwards. And so we're thinking about how we do that from a contract management perspective. So when I've worked in service design teams, how procurable is our specification? How manageable is our procurement? And we think about those three phases very distinctly. And I've learned this a little bit from Jimmy. We must lead by example as organisations. So think about what you're asking for. I think one of the examples you said to me very early on, Jimmy, was I was asked about a water conservation strategy in a procurement. Did I have one? And so very appropriately said, actually, I don't. But if you can let me have a copy of yours, then I can build something that works for me. And in that situation, the organisation was asking for something that they didn't have in their own toolkit. And so actually, we must think about in procurement, are we asking our suppliers to live a different reality to the one that we live? Why are we doing that? How proportionate is that? How right is that? And how able is this to live beyond the end of the contract? Social value doesn't live in contract terminology. Social value lives and breathes out with the contract. The contract is a mechanism. So how do we embed longevity in these social mechanisms that we're pushing through our contracts? And how do we make sure that we can continuously support the marketplace and improve as we go? And the final thing really from me is how do we implement this? So we came up with 5 implementable actions. So those sustainable development goals can be really useful if you're just starting out as a contracting authority and trying to figure out what your narrative is, or if you're a bidder, a marketplace provider. You can start with the sustainable development goals and think about which things are important to us. How do we align? And that might be by project or by category or by team, for example. How then do we develop a checklist, if we like, for making sure that through all the stages of the procurement lifecycle that we've embedded social value and we've supported our suppliers and local businesses to do what they need to do, especially to reduce carbon, deliver social impact, etc. And then actually, are the measurements and monitoring techniques that we've got, are they usable? Are they proportionate? Are they tangible? Will they actually measure the impact that we're creating? And we don't do any of this in isolation. We work as partners in social value. So are we collaborating across all stakeholders? Does it make sense to our organisations? And we know that this stuff is big and thorny and it isn't always easy and straightforward. So Go for Growth is, as always, here to help. So our contact details are on the slide. Please feel free to stay in touch with us if we can be of any help whatsoever. And I'll stop sharing for a minute and just see if we've got any questions. Time-wise, we've got a minute left to go if there's anything in the chat. So we've seen a cost element of a tender being as low as 20%, social value being 30%, and the remaining being technical functionality, which, feels about right, to be fair. We're seeing more and more of those things coming up. So brilliant. Jimmy, any last remarks from you?
Not specifically. I think, once again, just to reiterate, Go for Growth's there as an organisation to support the SME community and the local authority, public sector community generally. So if you like what we do, let people know, and that would be great.
Absolutely. Yeah, it can always feel like a really lowly place, whether you're in procurement or if you're in the marketplace. If you're a commissioner, contract manager, just give us a shout. The kettle is always on, metaphorically, obviously, but we are always happy to have a chat. We'll get the slides out. I know that was a canter through today, so we've covered quite a lot. So if anybody would like a further conversation with us or to drill down into more detail on anything that either Jimmy or I have talked about today, please do get in touch. We are here to help. So thank you everyone for taking time out of your busy calendars today. Jimmy, thank you for joining us. And we'll get the slides and the recording out in the next 48 hours, and have a good rest of your Tuesday, everyone.
Take care,
Thank you.
everyone. Bye.
Take care, everyone. Bye bye.